morning, everyone.
Morning.
What time is it?
Time.
Well, instinctively, most of us look down at our watch or we pull out our cell phones, something when we hear this question asked. It's a familiar question that we hear quite often, and sadly, we know that our lives are governed by time. We're painfully aware of time on a continual basis, from the moment that we wake up each day to the moment that we go to bed. It's time to wake up. It's time to eat. Time to go to work. Time for meetings. Time to go home. Time for dinner. Family time. Time for readings. Time to study. Time to go to bed. And before we know it, we're out of time, and it all begins again. Today's class is on time. Time is something that bothered Solomon a great deal. If you look at the number of questions that Solomon asks within the book of Ecclesiastes that relate to time, there's a preponderance of questions that he asks, and it reveals that he was really bothered by time. And I'd venture to say that time's something that bothers us as well. In fact, a simple listing of all the things that it's time for can be quite overwhelming. They can stir up feelings of anxiety within us. And as we saw yesterday from the word cloud, time is something that features quite prominently. In fact, if you were to look in Scripture at the words that are used for time, I found at least 9 unique words that relate to time, and they're used over 3,000 times in the Bible. But why? That's the question for today. Why did time bother Solomon? What are we to learn from time? And how does time fit into the Enigma of Ecclesiastes? Well, before getting into today's material, let's remind ourselves of where we left off yesterday in our journey of discovery. We concluded by taking a look at the executive summary of Solomon's work, and he led us on an inquiry of what has profit, what's the lasting value of living this life as an end in itself. And we saw that he investigated this question by giving himself to every avenue that he could possibly imagine, everything that he could possibly pursue. And at the end of it, when he got to the finish line, he looked back and he said, there's no lasting profit. There's nothing of value that can truly be extracted from living this life as an end in itself. He realized that everything that he had worked so hard for in this life would be left to somebody else, that he'd eventually die and be forgotten, just like everyone who had come before him. And it was at this point that we saw that Solomon turned from his own conclusion and gave the recommendation to each one of us. The recommendation that the best thing that we can do is to recognize God and to appreciate his simple blessings in our lives, to receive those things with thankfulness. And in chapters 3 through 6, what we find now is the supporting evidence that Solomon uses to establish the initial conclusions that he gave us in his executive summary. Today's first consideration on the evidence that Solomon provided is on time. So let's begin then with Solomon's consideration of time. We'll attempt to answer this first question of why time bothered so much, or why time bothered Solomon so much in verses 1 through 9. We'll see why it was that time bothered Solomon. And then in verses 10 through 22, we'll see what we're supposed to learn from time. And finally, we'll conclude by seeing how time fits into answering the enigma of Ecclesiastes. Well, as we read through chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, you probably recall these words because these are some of the best known words of Scripture in the Western world. They're associated with a song that took off in the 1960s, which is still popular today. But how many of us have really thought about what this chapter is speaking of? Is it just telling us that there's a time for everything? There's a time for everything to occur, or is there a deeper meaning? What's the tone of this chapter? Is it positive or is it negative? Well, after reading this chapter a number of times and thinking about what Solomon's saying here, thinking about some of the comments that he adds here after verses 1 through 8, there are a few things that really begin to rise to the surface. This chapter emphasizes something that many of us have realized at numerous points in our own life, that man is a slave of time. That's one of the major realizations that comes out of this chapter and the listing of all the things that it's time for. And in these first 9 verses, he emphasizes over and over again that all man can do is respond to the events of time that are brought into his life. Let me give you an example of where this happens. In verse 1, he says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." That word season is an appointed time. And the word time is a short duration. There's a short duration to every desire. And the scope is still under the sun. This life as an end in itself. So Solomon's saying at the very beginning of his consideration of time that everything has an appointed time in this life. But when that time comes, it's often short-lived. It's often very transient. It doesn't last. Man is governed by time and has to choose what the appropriate action is based on what time brings into his life. He begins in verse 2. There's a time to be born and a time to die. And right off the bat, he's establishing a couple of very important points. That even though time continues on, that's not the case for us. Each one of us has a finite amount of time, a clear beginning and a clear ending. But that beginning and that ending is not determined by us. We don't choose the time that we're born, and from natural standpoint, we don't choose the time that we die either. He continues on, where he goes and begins to talk about, well, when it's time to plant and it's time to harvest. People don't choose when they want to plant, the seasons do. It's no good saying, well, I'd rather harvest even though it's planting time. It doesn't work. Or if you want to go out and plant when it's harvest time, you're not going to get any food. You're just going to waste the seed that you sow. So he's saying, well, you can decide what to do, but really a wise person in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 5 is going to discern the time. That the best thing that you can do if you're wise is figure out what time is bringing into your life and respond appropriately. He goes on in verse 4 to say that there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And so when tragedy strikes, people will mourn, people will weep. And when good times come, they'll laugh and dance. It's no good saying when tragedy comes, well, I'm going to laugh because I'd rather laugh. We know that that doesn't really work. It's not realistic to think that way. He says in verse 7 that there's a time where it's more prudent to keep silence. And there's a time where it's more prudent to speak. But we know people that never seem to be able to keep silence. They always have something to say. And we know others that never seem to say anything, even when something does need to be said. So what's the answer as we look at all these couplets and as we see what Solomon's laying out here? How is one to determine when it's time to break down versus when it's time to build up? Or when to keep silence, when to speak? Or when is it time for war and time for peace? Solomon has already told us, or will tell us, that a wise man's heart can discern time, that he can discern judgment. And so the key point that comes out is the best that we can hope to do is to figure out what is being brought into our lives. And this is what bothered Solomon so much about time. For all of his wisdom, being the wisest man that had ever walked the earth, Solomon couldn't change, couldn't tell you what was going to happen one moment ahead of his own time. For all of his wisdom, all he could do was respond to what time brought into his life. And what this drove home to Solomon, what this burned indelibly into his mind, is that ultimately he had no control over his own life. And this is why time bothered Solomon so much. This is the point of the first 8 verses of the chapter. Even though we hear these songs and we listen to the words, it's telling us that we have no control over our own lives. Stop and think about that for a moment. That all we can do is respond wisely or foolishly to the events in our lives. Have you ever really thought about that before? Have you ever really considered that that's what's been placed before us? But what's the point of this? That's what Solomon asks. Why is this the case? In verse 9, look at what he says. What profit hath he that worketh, and all wherein he laboreth? If this life is what you have, and that's it, what are you supposed to take away from this consideration of time? Well, this consideration has led Solomon back to the same dead end of chapter 1 and verse 3, and in chapter 2 and verse 11, that there was no profit under the sun. That this life as an end in itself, if this life is all that you have, then there's no profit. Someone can work really hard, but life circumstances might dictate otherwise. And it's at this dead end that Solomon now introduces a consideration of God. Where was God in the first 8 verses of this chapter? Not there. But now Solomon is introducing God. And it's worth coloring it in, because 8 times here in these few series of verses, it's like an explosion of consideration as Solomon comes to this great realization that, wait a minute, where's God in the equation? We need to bring God into the consideration. And I believe that he's doing this for two reasons. To show that time exists for a purpose, that God's designed it this way to teach a lesson. It's not happenstance. God's designed it this way for a purpose. And the second is to contrast man with God. Man is constrained by time. God is not. And it's this realization that God has designed it this way that Solomon introduces God into the consideration of time. He says in verse 10, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. Sounds very familiar to something that we read in yesterday's class, doesn't it? Back in chapter 1 and verse 13, take a look at what he says. In chapter 1 and verse 13, he says, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. But when we get to chapter 3 and verse 10, there's a word missing. I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. There's the omission of the word sore, this word evil, that came up in chapter 1 and verse 13. So why is it that he's excluded this? Well, now Solomon's recognizing that instead of God being opposed to man, as he thought at the beginning of the study, he's beginning to realize that God has a purpose. And he no longer characterizes this as evil. He says, yes, it's still travail, it's still hardship, but it's not evil because God's involved. God has a plan, and he's exercising, he's humbling man. But why is it that he's humbling man? What's the intent? Is it just to put man in his place so that man can see what he is and so that God can declare that he's wonderful? Well, he says there's more to it than that. Solomon says in verse 11, he hath made everything beautiful in his time. So now the evil of chapter 1 and verse 13 has been replaced with beautiful. I thought, how strange. What is this word beautiful? And when you look throughout the rest of Scripture, you find that beautiful occurs 41 times in the Old Testament. And every single time that I could find, it spoke of the beauty of outward appearance. I thought, well, why is that? What's he trying to express? And what I realized is that Solomon's trying to tell us that even though you don't know how the times are working together, they will become apparent how they're working in your life. And when they do become apparent, it will be beautiful. And God will make it outwardly visible how the times have worked together in life. But the caveat is, it's in his time. It's not in our time. And this is a major struggle that the faithful have had all throughout time, trying to determine why things are happening the way that they are. What am I supposed to be learning from this circumstance in life? Why this trial? Why this difficulty? Isn't this something that you find yourself thinking about? Well, I know that I find myself thinking about this quite often. But Solomon says, in time, God will make it apparent how all of these times, how all of these events have worked to humble and to prepare us. He continues on in verse 11, where he says, also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. That word for world is olam. It means forever, eternity. That God has set eternity into the heart of man. What a contradiction. Man has a finite beginning and a finite ending, but within man's heart, God has put the desire for eternity. And that's what becomes frustrating to us. That's what becomes difficult, is we have this desire to live forever, but we have a limited amount of time in which we live on this earth. And this means that people have to make a choice. When we come to this realization that our lives are not in our control, we have a choice to make. Yes, we can control how we respond to the events in our life, but Solomon's saying you really can't control what comes into your life. And this is where we have to make a choice. The thought of not knowing what the future holds can bring a great deal of anxiety and frustration. And we see it all around us in the world today. Why do you think that the insurance companies are multi-million-dollar corporations? Because there's insurance for everything. Now, I'm not picking on insurance companies, but I'm exemplifying the point that people are very concerned about what's going to happen in the future, that they just don't know what's going to happen. That's one approach, isn't it? To be filled with anxiety, to try to make a lot of countermeasures that protect ourselves. Well, there's another approach that Solomon outlines, And the other approach is that the wisest course of action is to implicitly trust in God's commandments, in God's appointments, and to enjoy the simple and good things in life. A familiar message? It's the same thing that he said yesterday. Instead of focusing on all the things that you can't control, instead of focusing on all the things that are just going on, focus on doing good with the opportunities that you've been given. Look at what he says in verse 12. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. Don't worry about all the other things. Focus on doing good with the opportunities that God's given to you. This is the best choice that you can make. It's the best alternative to the frustration and the anxiety that the uncertainty of this life brings. Because while many things are going on around us that are outside of our control, Solomon's saying that there's two things that are in your control: your perspective and the way that you respond to those events. Make sure that you're making good decisions, is what he says. But look at what Solomon identifies as those good things in verse 13. It's not the luxuries of materialism. It's not the quote-unquote good life that we often think is necessary, the minimum threshold of what we need to have to be able to enjoy life and to live a fulfilled life. He says in verse 13 that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. Food and drink with a recognition that they come from God. And here is the contrast as he continues on between God and man. In verse 14, look at what he says. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. Whatever God does, it's going to be forever. And that word forever is olam. It's the same word that occurred earlier on in verse 11, that God set eternity into the hearts of man, but God is forever. Man has a desire to live forever, but God is forever. Nothing can affect the works of God. Man's works, when subjected to time, will crumble. They'll fall into disrepair. They'll go away. But God's works last forever. He's not subjected to time. Time doesn't exist to God. God has created time to govern this creation. And we think about, well, maybe it's like an equation of where there's one day to God is 1,000 years to us. It's not an equation. It's meant to show that time doesn't exist to God. And that's a very abstract concept to think about, of a reality of where time doesn't exist. But Solomon's really bending his mind, trying to understand how this works. And he's sharing with us the years of anxiety and frustration that it took for him to get to these conclusions. And why is it? Why is it that God subjects us to time? It's not because he enjoys seeing man suffer. It's what it says at the end of verse 14. God doeth it, that man should fear before him. This isn't the fear of dread. This is a reverential fear that's being developed. And at different points within the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is inserting the fear of God. And we're going to see the development of how this fear takes place in the life of a believer, and how Solomon expects us to develop reverential fear. This is the first occurrence of it. And it's all in regards to humility. That's the aspect that Solomon's bringing up here. So do you see the process that's being outlined here? That throughout the course of life, we're brought to the stark realization that we are not in control of our lives. And this realization, it humbles us. It exercises us, as he says in verse 9. It means to humble us as we contemplate how truly weak we are. But God's designed it this way. It's not an accident. He's designed it this way so that we're led to look for him. We're led to look for something better, to develop a reverential fear, to see that he can accomplish what we ourselves cannot. And so instead of becoming discouraged with the events of our lives, of not knowing what's going to happen, we move forward with the confidence that God will make things beautiful in his time, that he does have a plan, even if we don't particularly know how everything is working together in that plan at that particular point of time. And it may become beautiful in this life or in the life to come. Because let's face it, there's so many things in this life of where we don't exactly know how those things are working together. Solomon wanted to understand ultimate wisdom. And later on in chapter 7, he laments the fact that he couldn't figure it out. Sometimes we can look back with 20/20 hindsight and we can say, yeah, I really think that's how that was working in my life. But we don't absolutely know. And there's other times where we say, I still can't figure out what I was supposed to be developing there. And sometimes it's just that process of going through that thinking and realizing where we stand in relation to God. That's development in and of itself. Remember here that the scope of Solomon's inquiry is still life under the sun. This life as a reward. But we're starting to get inklings that perhaps Solomon's realizing that, my scope is a bit too narrowly defined. That if I'm looking for everything to reconcile in this life, for all the loose ends to be tied up, I'm not going to find it now. It's not going to make sense at the end of the day. Everything's not going to be reconciled. Perhaps I need to look beyond this life to be able to make sense of this life. And so you imagine in the first 9 verses, somebody living under the sun, baking under the heat of the sun, working under the toil of the sun, not really understanding why the hardships are there, but knowing that it's hard work. And it's almost as though in verse 10, Solomon lifts his eyes and realizes, what about God? Where is God in this whole equation? How does God fit in? And he realizes that there's a purpose. He's beginning to see the sun. And it's this figurative lifting of the eyes that he begins to consider eternity, that he begins to consider olam. And instead of time being the great determiner of man's fate, he realizes that God is at work. Solomon's learning that life cannot be understood without a recognition and a reverence of God. This life cannot be understood without a recognition and a reverence of God. There is no profit in this life without that recognition. And as we read on in verse 15, we see what Solomon says. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. Very familiar words to the beginning of the book, that there's nothing new under the sun. In other words, Solomon's saying, forget about novel achievement in this life. It's an endless cycle of vanity and repetition. Rather, focus on doing good now, with the opportunities that you have now. God's given you now. Don't know what you have in the future, but you have now. And once now is gone, you'll never get it back. You can't go back in time. Once now is gone, it's finished. And once it's finished, God's going to require what you've done with now. And it's easy to think about this when we're at Bible school and we're spending all day thinking about God's Word and fellowshipping with each other. But what about when we go home from this place? How are we using our time? And so, as you continue reading on, you see that there's implicitly here the aspect of a future judgment at the end of verse 15. This aspect of judgment is coming forward. But if Solomon's beginning to figure out that his scope is too narrowly defined, this life as an end in itself, well, when is this judgment going to take place? Is it in this life? And so as he looks around, he's trying to figure out, will eventually God make everything right? The good guy wins in the end? The bad guy has bad things happen to him? So that's what he does in verse 16. It says, and moreover I saw. These transitional words in Ecclesiastes are important because there's times when Solomon's on this internal monologue. He's thinking about life. And then he says, well, let me see how this is practically demonstrated in everyday life. So we see these types of words. It's worth coloring them in because they show a transition of thought. Chapter 4 and verse 1 is another one. I returned and I saw. Well, that's what's happening here in verse 16. He's saying, well, let me see where the thoughts that I have are practically demonstrated in life. So look at what he says in verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. So he's looking for righteousness, he's looking for justice, and he goes to the place where those should have been held in regard. The people who were supposed to administrate righteousness. But instead he sees lawlessness in the place where righteousness was supposed to be done. He found that it was absent. And so Solomon's led to conclude in verse 17 It's not going to happen at this present time. I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. God's appointed a time to do this. But at the present time, in verse 18, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see themselves that they are beasts. God has allowed injustice to continue, to show mankind that they themselves, that we ourselves, are no better than the animals. People look around at the injustice of this life and they say, well, this is evidence that God doesn't exist. How could a righteous God allow this to exist? But Solomon turns that whole argument on his head, and he says the fact that these things are continuing, the fact that these things exist, is evidence that there is a God. It's all part of God's plan. He says that God allows these things to continue to show mankind how utterly incapable we are of fixing our own problems, and that left to ourselves, we are no better than the animals. We don't like to think about that, but that's what Solomon's saying. And that's the truth of the matter, isn't it? We've been given all kinds of ability, all kinds of freedoms to fix the problems that we've created. But where is this world at? Are we finding the solutions? Quite the contrary. And Solomon says God's allowing this to continue so that you know that you need to look for something better beyond this life. You need to look to Him to have things make sense and for things to reconcile. He says that when you die, you go back to the dust, just like the animals. That's what he continues saying in verses 20 and 21. These are verses that we look at in our first principles classes to show that there's no difference between people and animals when we die. People may have theories on what happens, but he says nobody really knows. God knows, and God reveals it to us. But you don't know because thoughts cease to exist at that point. He says at the end of verse 22, "Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Man doesn't know what's coming. And once time is over, it's over. That person can't see anything after that point. And so for someone who's looking purely at this life, the best thing that they can enjoy are the few simple things that they were able to accomplish, because that's all that they really have. And so Solomon realized in verse 15 that there is going to be a judgment, but that judgment is not going to take place in this life. He observes this in verses 16 to 22, that things will not be equitable now, that things will not reconcile now. Instead, will be brought to the realization that mankind is no better than the animals, that injustice exists in this life to show us what we are and how much we truly need God. And this is a major realization of Solomon's consideration of time, that time is designed to get us to look to God for a solution. Think about this for a moment. There's so many people who live this life looking for fulfillment, looking for lasting joy, while excluding God from the process. But Solomon's telling us that God's designed this life to not make sense without Him. He's designed this life so that things will not make sense without a recognition of God. That He's designed this life to be uncertain. He's designed this life to be frustrating. He's allowed it to be unjust. Not because He enjoys seeing people suffer, but because He wants us to look inward and to realize that we don't have the solution. It's God who has created us, and not we ourselves. And He wants us to look to Him. But people who don't do this, people who don't seek after God, are like the people who go to the casinos and continue to gamble, thinking that one day they're going to win, but not realizing that the whole institution has been set up to make them lose. It's a sad reality. I was just at the corner store and buying some milk in a few weeks previous as I was looking at this material. And I saw a man who was cashing his whole paycheck, buying lottery tickets, $20 lottery tickets, $30 lottery tickets. And he's asking the cashier, well, how much money do I have left? Trying to figure out which additional lottery tickets he could buy. I thought, how sad. But how many people do that with their lives? We look at that from a monetary standpoint and think, well, that's not very wise. But how many people do that with their lives? How many of us are doing that with our lives? Thinking with one foot that maybe we can gain something from this life, while knowing on the other hand that there's really nothing lasting to be gained in this life. And you can see what happens. It's the same dead end every single time. The heartache and depression that comes from pursuing a pathway that leads to the same dead end. And you can see why a world without God, why a world that rejects Him, is one that's filled with frustration and anxiety and with depression. Just look around. That's what everyone around us is living. But how does this help us solve the enigma of Ecclesiastes? Well, let's turn to Romans chapter 8 for a moment, because I believe that Paul picks up on this theme. Romans chapter 8 and verse 18. The more I've begun to look at it, the more I've seen that Paul, the Lord Jesus Christ, thinking people really love the book of Ecclesiastes, and how they take these principles and they expand them. Paul's going to add an aspect to this that Solomon discusses but doesn't particularly name. Let's go ahead and read verses 18 to 25. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, and not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit. Even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for what we see not, then do we with patience wait for it. You see the similarities there of what Paul is bringing out in Romans 8 versus what we were just reading about in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Romans 8 and verse 18, that the sufferings of this present life are contrasted against the future glories. There's trials, there's difficulties, this travail that we face in our lives at this point in time. There's an earnest expectation of immortality that Paul speaks of in Romans 8 and verse 19. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11 that God has set eternity in our hearts, the desire to live forever. The creature is made subject to vanity. All is vanity, as Solomon says in chapter 3 and verse 19. But it's not pointless, it's not meaningless that these things are happening. God has subjected the same in hope, is what we read in Romans chapter 8 and verse 20. But the process is painful. It's difficult. Being exercised, being humbled, is not something that we say, you know what, I'm going to be a humble person. We don't humble, God humbles us. Our response to God is what brings about humility. And that's a painful process. But it's designed to create hope in us, is what Paul says in Romans 8, verse 24. And what is added to what Solomon says is here at the bottom, that we must have patience in God's process. Solomon has kind of danced around this concept of patience. And the conclusion is that, yes, you need to have patience. He will make things beautiful in his time. But Paul puts his finger on it and says, patience is what you need when pursuing the reward. Patience in God's hope staves off frustration and despondency, is what Paul is revealing to us. And it's getting to the point of where we realize that there's futility in the flesh that we possess. Yes, that's important. That's a realization that God needs us to make. And it's a realization that we learn from life's circumstances over and over and over again. It comes in all forms, doesn't it? Family turmoil, ecclesial struggle, sickness of loved ones, unexpected tragedy, personal failures that we just can't seem to overcome. every time that this realization comes before our faces, we're at a very precarious precipice because we stand right on the edge and we're looking over the edge and we're looking at ourselves. It's very easy at this point to feel an overwhelming sense of despair, that we just can't do it. We can't make any progress. This is the natural reaction. But what we need to realize is that this is part of God's design. Not to destroy us, but to get us to look to Him for anticipation of something better. God's created that desire for eternity within us, but He needs us to work with patience, discerning the time, trying to figure out what is wise and what is foolish. How can we respond to the events that have been brought into our lives using His wisdom? But why is it that Paul understood this so well? Is it because it was just revealed to Paul through the Spirit? Well, that's part of it. But I believe that Paul lived this in his own life. Consider just for a moment what Paul went through before he became Paul as Saul. Saul was one who did not discern the time. He was like the rest of the Jews who didn't know the time of their visitation, as the Lord Jesus Christ said. And he found himself fighting against God. His own teacher, Gamaliel, said, "You might not want to do this because you might find that you're fighting against God." And what does the Lord Jesus Christ say? That he was persecuting him. That's what Paul was doing, or Saul rather was doing. And he was living under the sun. He was feeling the oppression of this life. What was it that came on the road to Damascus but a bright light that shone down on Saul? What happened to Saul? He was blinded. He was shown that he was living in spiritual darkness. He couldn't behold the sun for a season, as we see in 22 and verse 11 and 13 and verse 11 of Acts. And God exercised him. God humbled him. That's why Paul could write these things in Hebrews chapter 12 of how God works with children, because he himself was humbled in his own life. He was exercised through the events that transpired. And what happened when Ananias came to Paul? He was given his sight. Those days of darkness, of where he thought about how he was living the wrong way, how he wasn't discerning the time, how he was actually fighting against God, fighting the times that God was bringing into his life, allowed him to have clarity of spiritual vision. And he was given back his natural vision as a way of showing that he had made this development. And the result is that he went from Saul, somebody who was mighty, to Paul, somebody who was small. And this humility made Paul the greatest apostle to the Gentiles. Paul learned the truth of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 through the experiences of life. And it's the case for each one of us as well. We may cognitively know these things. We may say, yeah, I know that to be the case. But it's through life's experiences that we have to develop the patience to really understand what these words mean. Because we may think it's time for one thing, but in reality, God reveals it's time for something else. We had a situation like that this summer, of where we had Vacation Bible School all week. Very involved. Kelly was very involved with Vacation Bible School, and we were really looking forward to the end of the week to be able to spend some family time and go camping. So we thought, well, it's time for camping. So Kelly was on her way home from Vacation Bible School, but then she was broadsided by a semi. And we realized that our plans of what we thought it was time for wasn't the case. Thankfully, it hit on the right quarter panel in the passenger side, right above the tire. Look at how much damage was done to the vehicle. The car was totaled. My daughter was in the front seat, Kathleen, and she was trapped between the airbag and the window. And we thought, what if it just would have been a fraction of a second later? What if? Now, I don't know why this happened, but I can tell you that we've had a lot more meaningful family time ever since this happened, and we've had a lot more conversations about the simple things of life than we ever would have had going camping together. Each one of us has circumstances like this in our own lives, of where it's brought home with sledgehammer force that we are absolutely not in control of our own lives. And we have to make the decision to rely on God and to realize that He does have a plan for us. Because when we come to the rest of Scripture, we can see that it picks up this concept of time, and it tells us what we're expected to learn from time. Christ expects us to discern the time, is what we're told in Luke 12 and verse 56. In Matthew 16 and verse 3, and the Jews, those who Christ came to immediately, in the first case, were destroyed because they didn't know the time of their visitation, in Luke 19 and verse 44. And to be acceptable, for us to be accepted, it's not just a matter of how can I figure out what I can do in my life to help me. Christ says, well, you need to figure out how to be a good steward. Figure out what's appropriate in a particular time to administer to others. To know the right time to give help, in Matthew 24 and verse 45, in Luke 12 and verse 42. And so discerning the time drives spiritual activity, is what we're told in Romans 13 and verse 11. It's no good sitting back and saying, yeah, I know what's going on. It drives activity because we realize that we have a limited amount of time. And so we have to redeem the time, as Paul tells us in Ephesians 5 and verse 16 and Colossians 4 and verse 5. And that will result in exaltation in due time, as 1 Peter 5 and verse 6 tells us. And so this process that Solomon's outlining is the development of humility, which leads to a reverence of God, which ultimately results in an exaltation, in the giving of eternal life. And as we've considered Solomon's thoughts on time, it's worth us asking, how am I using my time? Am I discerning the time properly? Am I making the right decisions? How many times do we find ourselves fighting against God's time, against what has been brought into our lives? It's important to ask ourselves to see what we're truly doing. There's a quote that says, time is what we want the most, but what we use the worst. And isn't that true in a lot of ways as we think about our own lives? So what have we learned today about time? Time dictates appropriate action in our lives, not our desire. We can wish for whatever we want, but based on the circumstances of life, that dictates the appropriate action. And this uncertainty of time makes man's efforts vain in this life. If you were to live this life as an end in itself, time makes actions irrelevant. Time is created, however, for a specific purpose, to get mankind to look to God for something better. And life cannot be understood without a recognition of time or a recognition of God. God will reveal why things have happened in His time, but we can't worry about things that we can't control. We have to focus on doing good with the opportunities that God's given to us, and God will judge us based on how we've used our time. And so we have to use the time now to prepare for the future. I'd just like to conclude by looking at one final reference from Paul the Apostle to see how this principle is exemplified in the New Testament. Taking an excerpt from Ecclesiastes 3, we read, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it, that men should fear before him. And the familiar words of Hebrews 12, verses 6 through 11. Taking an excerpt from this, for whom the Lord loveth he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? Continuing on, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Look at the similarity of the words that come up. Travail, chastening, scourging. A lot of difficulty associated with this process. But why is it given? For the purpose of exercise, for the purpose of being humbled. But it's not vain. It's not empty. God does it that men should fear before him. And he does it for our benefit, that we might be partakers of his holiness, and so that the peaceable fruit of righteousness might be produced. Let's not just accept this fact, and somewhat reluctantly, that we're not in control of our lives. Let's embrace the fact that God is working in our lives, humble ourselves before him, and make the most of the opportunities to do good in his service. God has a plan, And it will be beautiful, but it's going to be in His time.